Before we begin, I would like to also mention that this lecture, the series of lectures, are co-sponsored by the Chamorro Studies Program, and Dr. James Verdes has made arrangements for us to use this hall. The MARC Lecture Series is a series to encourage the community awareness of topics and issues of importance to the Micronesian region. We thank you very much for being here tonight. Our speaker tonight is the president of the university, Dr. Robert Underwood. Dr. Underwood has been a university professor, a distinguished scholar with many publications, director of the bicultural program that helped to establish the Chamorro language curriculum within the Guam Department of Education. He has been a congressional delegate in the U.S. House of Representatives. With all these experiences, one character stands out with this man. He is and always will be a staunch advocate for Pacific Island understanding themselves and their roles in our society and in the world. Please put your hands together and welcome Dr. Robert Underwood.
Thank you very much, Arlene. Buenas noches todos, Hamzo. Half a day. Okay, I want to make sure everything's covered, Spanish and Chamorro. I'm really proud to be the first speaker in this lecture series, and I'm glad that Dr. James Vernes made it possible for us to use this facility for free. Thank you, Chamorro Study. What I propose to do this evening is a little bit complex to me, and I've tried to kind of simplify it in my own mind. And at the same time, I want you to think seriously about it, because it may challenge some assumptions that we all have. Most of us in the room have been involved in the struggle for things Chamorro. Chamorro people, Chamorro peoplehood, Chamorro nationalism, Chamorro language, revival of Chamorro culture as we understand it to be. And in that interplay of all those things, there are a couple of really, in my mind, unresolved issues about what it means to be Chamorro, and what does the word Chamorro mean? And so what I propose to do this evening is to tell you when the first Chamorro was born, NGAI'AN, and who it was. Well, I don't really know who it was, but I have a good idea of when it happened, and in official terms. The Richard F. Taitano Micronesian Area Research Center is, of course, a very special entity for the university, and I fully comprehend its value and potential to the people of Micronesia, the Marianas, and Guam. It is made more special by the fact that it is named after Richard Flores Taitano, a role model for me as my uncle and as my political hero, and more importantly, a fellow critic of things as they are. He had a very different view of things, in the same way I think that I've learned in our family, in our extended family, to view things critically. The history and the authenticity of the Chamorro people has been a constant source of conversation and analysis for at least 2 centuries. No term in the history of the Marianas carries more meaning and fosters more mythological uses than the term Chamorro. I want to share my perspective on its current uses as well as its historical use. Perhaps more importantly, I want to examine the historical record of when it went into official use and its potential. Now, this is not a discussion of Chamorro or Chamorro, or how to spell it. The RRO officially died last year, so I just wanted to point that out. It was officially killed by the Guam legislature. So now we're going to have other arguments about CHamoru, but the RRO version is officially dead. This is not a discussion about the origins of the people who settled the Marianas some 4,000 years ago. Those original inhabitants are not the people that we come to know and understand as the CHamoru people. Whenever I teach HI 211, the history of Guam, I begin with the question, where did the CHamoru people come from? And I hear many different responses and the usual theories, including, and I conclude the conversation by pointing out that this is the easiest question in the world to answer. Whomever we think the CHamoru people are, they were formed in the Marianas Islands. That is to say, the sum total of the historical experience of the people, their interaction with each other, their adaptation and utilization of this island and this ocean environment created the conditions for the formation of the people that we now refer to as CHaMorus. They are from the Marianas Islands. So, anybody ask you where do the CHamoru people come from? That's the easiest question in the world. They come from the Marianas Islands. The lived experience of human beings in these islands provide the basis for understanding who they are at key points in the past. Unless you believe, and I do not discount this belief automatically, that human beings originated here in Guam, specifically near Homata. The creation myths of Puntan and Fo'una, Saifi near Sasalaguan, can provide as satisfying a structure for understanding the origins of human beings as does Adam and Eve, or the origin of the physical islands as does the Japanese brother and sister team of Izangi mo Mikoto and Mignoto no Izazami, who formed the Japanese islands. A brother and sister team, just like Puntan and Fo'una. CHamoru mythology can be as compelling as other places. But unlike the Hawaiians or the Maoris, the people of the Marianas never acknowledge that they came from somewhere else. In other words, they believe that they started right here and that so did everybody else. In the Marianas of the 21st century, we use archaeological reference points to determine time frames for settlement and descriptions of the human experience here. We use terms like indigenous, native, and colonization to explain who we are as a people, and more specifically to explain who the CHamoru people are and how they came to be. Some community and political leaders like to say that the CHamoru people came to these shores 4,000 years ago. They claim that we have approximately a 4,000-year-old history, but the contours of this history have a lot of blank spaces and twists and turns which we have yet to discover, and patterns which have been formed at only the most rudimentary level. Most archaeologists, like Dr. Mike Carlson, and I recommend that you read his archaeological work because he's the first archaeologist to give actual periodization to the settlements up in Ritidian, up in the Tecta. Most archaeologists have presented evidence that human beings have inhabited these islands for about 3,500 years. We tend to think of our 3,500-year-old experience and history in two increments: the prehistory, pre-Western contact, ancient time period, and the post-contact historical time period. The first 3,000 years of our history is based on narratives which are strongly felt, but for which evidence is largely drawn from archaeology, ethnographic studies completed in other places, and a great deal of conjecture. Sometimes the conjecture is enriched with a lot of imagination. A lot of imagination. We do know and suspect that the development of the Lati stone culture and related pottery some 1,200, 1,300 years ago may be an indicator that multiple migrations to the islands had occurred. Perhaps there was an invasion of a Lati building people. The 500 years of post-contract history since the arrival of Magellan in 1521 is the part of our past which can be reconstructed through documents and histories as written. We acknowledge that much of the evidence we have in the post-contact period is biased and one-sided and incomplete, but it is possible to explain and study actual events from the past. And without actual events, it isn't history. That's the difference between history and anthropology, and history and archaeology. History has to have actual events. If there are no events, and there's just a discussion about things as they might have happened, that's not history. Activists proclaim that the indigenous people have a special relationship to, obligation for, and a special place in these islands. We call these people CHamoru, and we claim that it is their land on our license plates, but not really their land, but it's on our license plates. Tano CHamoru. It needs to be pluralized, by the way. They are also called Tautotano, or people of the land, and in this activist indigenous perspective, our historical experience is filled with references to genocide, depopulation, colonization, reduction, and denial of rights. Our task is to recover, revive, and rediscover ourselves, our true selves. I guess our current selves are wanting in some fashion. The imagined past, as in the pre-existing 3,000 years before Magellan's arrival, some 500 years ago, really reflects who we are, our true past, and our true genius. The events which occurred after Magellan arrived tell us a different story. Every dimension of our lives since Magellan is a contested field of power and survival in which we're noble savages living in harmony with nature and with each other. That is our imagined world. However, in reality, most everything that is knowable about our CHamoru experiences and our memories and our documents and our realities is in the past 350 years. And apparently, that's our knowable history, and apparently, most of it is pretty disagreeable. But the term CHamoru itself was not used by Magellan or subsequent voyagers. Early colonizers did not utilize the term either, and CHamoru doesn't really exist in the documentary form until the 19th century. An examination of the term CHamoru becomes necessary if we are to more fully comprehend who we are as CHamoros today, or perhaps equally important, who we are not. We must affix the time of birth for the first CHamoru so that we can understand ourselves more fully. In the Marianas of the 20th century, which I'm looking around, most of you grew up in, most of you are 20th century people. The activist indigenous perspective was just beginning, but the conventional wisdom was pretty clear. As were many native peoples around the world, CHamoros were discussed in terms of their physical appearance and bloodline, almost as if they were a breed of animals. MARC's first director and historian Paul Carano wrote, "Present-day Guamanians are as a rule of good physique and pleasing appearance." I'm so glad to hear that. They do not, however, possessed the stature and robust health which characterized the ancient Chamorros, their remote ancestors. In this conventional wisdom, the pre-contact Chamorros were decimated and the men were killed off. Subsequently, the women intermarried or had children with males from all over the world, but mostly Mexicans, Filipinos, or Spaniards. This mixing produced a new group of people who became farmers, not fishermen, Catholics, and were so-called civilized. The process could be ugly in this civilization process because it involved murder, disease, decimation, and forced resettlements, all of which happened to the people of the Marianas. But, you know, in the end, it was all worth it because pre-contact Chamorros were no longer primitive. This was the narrative given to the Chamorro people, and they accepted it. Every historical event is a Western-dominated world symbolic of some progress. The dislocation and inhumane treatment experienced at the beginning of colonialization was worth it because it resulted in progress in the end. The West believes that progress occurs in a world that they are managing, and we are the beneficiaries of that progress, regardless of the cost that was paid. There are two curious narratives that come out of this experience in which pre-contact Chamorros ceased to exist. These narratives are used to help explain the discontinuity and the degradation of the Chamorro people. The first is the use of non-indigenous males as the driving force of colonial societies and the alteration of the native people. This is part of a colonial narrative which helps cement the domination of outsiders over the native people of the Marianas. The Chamorro people themselves are cast as feminine recipients of these external masculine forces. This reinforces sexual imagery and male-dominated family imagery, the complete domination and reformulation of the indigenous people. This dominance of the foreign male narrative is common throughout all of Latin America and present even in the American West. The end result was a race of half-breeds, mixed stock people, mixed stock, that's again the animal reference, that would make money for future DNAancestry.com businesses. Have you all gotten your kit yet? So you can find out how this actually happened in your own life. And you know, it might change who you are. I find those advertisements fascinating because people are no longer who they are until they take a DNA test. For many years, I heard from a well-known Guam historian, Robert, we are just Mexicans and Filipinos who speak Chamorro. The women taught the mother tongue, and so the language itself survived the colonial experience until the Americans showed up. Now they're killing off the language, doing a pretty good job. I characterized this in the late 1970s in my first foray into teaching on television, culture and education on Guam as the Chamorro Denial Perspective. Basically, the line of continuity between ancient Chamorros and modern-day Chamorros was broken, and that any claim to a direct line was historically and culturally inaccurate in the 1970s and 1980s. I argued that we could legitimately reconstruct the connection. The term Guamanian itself was used and was an impediment to the process of rediscovery. Guamanian was weaponized as a force for discontinuity in the cultural continuity discussion about Chamorro people in the 20th century. The second colonial narrative, and which discusses native and conquered peoples as the result of race mixing. Interestingly, the race mixing is explained as weakening the native peoples and sapping their strength. See, the more mixed you are, the weaker you get. Their physical condition and their moral fiber. Pure-blooded or purebred natives were seen as possessing dignity and admirable physical qualities, which have been lost through racial admixture. The colonial narrative on mixing bloodlines doesn't enhance the native breed, it degrades it. One would think that physical contact with colonizers would result in offspring who were stronger and smarter and more eager to engage the future. Instead, if you're a product of these admixtures, you are half-breeds who have lost your dignity. It is one of the strangest and most contradictory of colonial narratives which has been placed upon native peoples, and native peoples accept that. That's the danger of that. In attempting to understand this, the work of the physical anthropologist Jane Underwood is crucial. I've only met her once, and she's not my relative. But she has a great name. She put together a population of history which assumed, which examined the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of the population of the Marianas, and even the terminology that had been used through the centuries. In the native origins of the Neo-Chamorros of the Marianas Islands, published in Micronesia in 1971, she recounted the documentary evidence of the population history of the Marianas. The islands had a population of 3,197 natives and 427 mestizos in the year 1710, which was a significant drop from the 50 to 100,000 estimates of the missionaries upon the arrival of San Vitores. Of course, the missionaries had lots of reasons to exaggerate, but it was still pretty obvious that significant depopulation had occurred as a result of warfare, disease, and perhaps a loss of will to live. It's important to note that by the end of the time period of the so-called Spanish Chamorro Wars, Chamorro women were deliberately aborting their babies, and in some instances would take the babies down and drown them at the shoreline, simply because the world had changed so dramatically for them. Quoting Freycinet, Underwood points out that out of 3,169 residents in 1786, this is about 75 years later, there were 1,318 natives. Freycinet finally reported that only one pure-blooded man and woman existed in 1817. So, you know, it's obvious that if you have a bunch of people who are so-called mestizos and a handful that are people who are Indios or natives, that over time the natives would have to spend all their time with each other, or they're simply going to disappear. She recounted this even as she seemed to argue against a substantial admixture of foreign blood into the Marianas, at least to the point of extinction for Chamorros. Extinction of the ancients was the conventional wisdom of the 20th century when Jane Underwood wrote this article. The significance of her work needs to be understood in this context. She was the first one to provide physical evidence that contradicted the belief that the pre-contact Chamorro contribution to their descendants was negligible. She wrote, "The lack of congruence between the expected biological attributes of a hybrid population to which the native contribution would have been so negligible, and the observed data from anthropometric, osteological, and blood studies among Neo-Chamorro groups has proven irreconcilable." she argued that the Neo-Chamorros weren't as neo as some people thought. Now, it's important to know that the only way we can uncover this is to continue to study the remains of people. Unless you just don't want to know. You have to study it. If you don't want to know, then don't study it. That's an important thing that remains. And I'm sure if Jane Underwood were alive, she'd still say that. But they still weren't called Chamorros just yet. And in the census data throughout the 18th century in the Marianas and the early 19th century, the natives were referred to as Indios, and their mixed progeny were called mestizo in keeping with Spanish colonial practices. Frequently, they were called Marianos, since they were from the Marianas Islands. I guess they would have been called Ladrones if the original name from Magellan's visit had stayed with map makers. In this way of identifying people, mestizos would eventually prevail over natives, because natives had to continually marry other natives in order to maintain a so-called pure bloodline. Freycinet gave a review of the numbers and the nomenclature for the natives of the island, and this is where most of the conversation comes from when we talk about the origin of the word Chamorro. It really comes from Freycinet. Freycinet, he offered a couple of explanations for the use of the term Chamorro, which was starting to be used in the early part of the 19th century. And he said, including the version given by Don Luis de Torres, who, is a direct ancestor for some of us here. So Don Luis de Torres, who claimed that it was a corruption of drop the rudder, or as Larry Cunningham would say, don't use the rudder. So that's pretty interesting. CHamoru, Ulin's rudder, which was shouted by the chiefs as the canoes started to get near the foreign vessels. They would say, CHamoru! I don't know, they got Chamorro out of that. But, it's pretty good. I don't know why they didn't get CHamoru out of that. But then there's also the use of the Spanish word to describe shaved heads, which was omnipresent in pre-contact Chamorro society. In either case, Freycinet was pretty sure that the Aboriginal race is far from forming not only the majority of the population today, but of the bloodline of the population. He did give an uncharitable description of the current inhabitants, which almost everybody gives to the Chamorros once they find out that there's some kind of mixed breed people. He did give this version. He said, they are not constrained by anything and blindly give free rein to their passions and wishes. So these people were disorderly and just, did everything they wanted. And so I thought he was talking about millennials, but it was too early in history for that. Freycinet's view of Chamorro genetics and its impact on the 20th century denial convention wisdom was very strong. The colonial narrative of a degraded population characterized by a lack of strength and lack of pre-contact bloodlines was in full bloom in the early 1900s and already existing from the previous century. Now, writing in the 1880s, Spanish Governor Francisco Olive Garcia reviews the nomenclature as well, and he describes them. He refers to them as Marianos, which was a common term in the 18th century. He reports that in 1825, there were 2,683 indigents, meaning natives, and 3,220 and 18 in the other category. The other groups included both mestizos and Criollos, who were assumed to be basically from European roots, who were born in the colonies. Olive also reports that Governor Villalobos had started a reorganization of the government, which was described as the reforms in the 1830s. So Villalobos changed the nature of government in the Marianas Islands. These reforms included new taxes in various economic activities and the creation of cabecerias or barangays with leaders called cabezas, the head of the barangay. And the barangay is a term that is borrowed from the Philippines, and of course cabezas from Spanish. But interestingly, this became in Chamorro, barangay became balangay. And this was still in fairly common use, I would say, up until World War II. After World War II, hardly any Chamorro speaker knows what balangay is. But I have heard the term, and it was used to describe small units in much the same way that you see barangay in the Philippines. According to Olive, everybody was designated as Chamorro in the 1830s in order to avoid higher taxes, which was imposed on mestizos. So now you had a choice. You could be a mestizo and pay taxes, or you could be a Chamorro and avoid taxes. Count me in. So the social value of being a mestizo did not outweigh the benefits of reduced taxes. So the actual first use of the term Chamorro for official purposes occurred in the 1830s. And it coincided with these government reforms, the imposition of new taxes, and to some extent, it reflected also the creation of an emerging group of people who equally called themselves Chamorro. Olive landed in Guam in November 1884, a few months after the assassination of Governor Dos Passos by a Chamorro soldier named Jose Salas in 1884. Salas and 3 other Chamorro soldiers, Agun, Acosta, and Mendola, were executed in 1885 for being part of a plot to overthrow Spanish rule. So within 50 years, the consciousness of Chamorro, being a member of some group of people called Chamorro, these soldiers were not killing Dos Passos and shouting, "Hural sent us here," or "Matapan, long live Matapan," because that wasn't part of their worldview. They were seeing themselves as a group different from the Spaniards and having an understanding that they may have connection to the ancient Chamorros, but they weren't doing it in the name of the ancient Chamorros. Within 50 years, they took action in full consciousness of this new but different identity. It is clear that the Spanish colony in Hagatna were very concerned that Chamorros were starting to behave like Filipinos in the Philippines who were getting on with their own revolution, or other nationalists in Latin America who have already broken away. The question arises whether Chamorro, as it was emerging in this environment, especially in the second half of the 19th century, saw themselves as a kind of new nationality awaiting political rights, or as a continuing dispossessed indigenous group. These Chamorros were Catholics, they were farmers, they traded with whalers, and some had acquired technical skills in various occupations and professions. Were they Indios? Did they see themselves as Indios subject to the Spanish crown? Or were they approximating their Filipino and Mexican counterparts who were engaged in their own projects of nation building? Is the formation of the word tomorrow more connected to the development of Filipino and Mexicano than they were to an Aboriginal reality? Now, in Olive's words as well, Olive recounts how things have become degraded in the Marianas Islands because Chamorros were chamorizing everything. They were chamorizing their social reality. Their ability to speak Castellano started to drop off. A lot of older people spoke more English than they did Castellano because they were trading with the whalers. And so in Olive's eyes, this was emerging as a slightly different group, a little bit out of control. The term Filipino was originally applied to Spaniards born in the Philippines. They were Criollos, Europeans born in the colonies, who were developing a lifestyle reflective of the Iberian Peninsula, but different stylistically. Filipinos originally did not include Tagalogs, Visayans, Ilocanos, and certainly not Moros. It took the development of Filipino nationalism to co-opt the word and forever change the meaning of Filipino. One of the first appropriations of the term Filipino was by Jose Rizal, who wrote about Filipino youth in his poem A la Juventud Filipina, first published in 1879. Although it praises the Spanish contribution, he clearly argues that the future of the Philippines belongs to young Filipinos like himself. Some tried to take the nationalist project further. Andres Bonifacio suggested Haring Bayang Katagulugan instead of Republica and Pilipinas. The fact that it was really arguing like he was creating a Tagalog nation, because that's the root word there in Katagulugan, was being declared, ensured the proposal's short term of life, because the unity of different languages and ethnic groups in the Philippines was possible only under the use of the term that the colonial reality gave them. A group of islands named after King Felipe and calling themselves Filipinos. Mexicano is based on the Nahua, Aztec word Mexica. It was utilized early as a term to describe all who lived in Mexico or New Spain as far back as the 16th century. As an official term, Mexicano coincided with the Mexican War of Independence in the 1810s. It is a word most associated with the annual Grito de Mexicano on the 16th of September. As an official cultural and political philosophy, Mexico followed the mestizaje model, and it is reflected in the 1917 Constitution, which declares Mexico to be indivisible, pluricultural. It celebrates its mestizo roots, doesn't shy away from them, it celebrates them. It says that is the core essence of the identity of Mexico. Now, in both Mexico and the Philippines, it is possible, even today, to be an indigenous person. But it usually means you are not in the mainstream of the national project. Just ask the Ifugao or the Maya. They're not in the mainstream of the Philippines or in Mexico. Today, I don't think of very many individuals on Guam who look to the Filipino or Mexican national project as a source for inspiration or comparison for Guam or the Marianas Islands. I may be the only one. I'm the only guy who thinks this. I may be the only guy. I mean, maybe others won't. If they look at the record, they might think differently. People are forced to look at influence and practices and even acknowledge some common ancestry under the aegis of the Spanish Empire. But today's Chamorro reality and sense of Chamorro-ness, it is done begrudgingly. It's not done to recognize it as part of their past. It's done in a begrudging way, as if they resent that it's part of their past. That's dangerous. It's hard to imagine, and it's hard to ignore titizas, or tamales, or atulinilotes, or porto, or bibinka, or tuba. These are all quintessentially Chamorro, and they're part of the Chamorro historical experience. Yet, of course, the last set comes from the Philippines, and the former set comes from Mexico. Now, what do young people look to for inspiration today? Okay. We're more likely to look at indigenous peoples around the world for inspiration and connections. The ones that lend themselves the most to comparison are indigenous groups who also live in modern Western societies as minority groups. This seems to be our Chamorro fate as well. For those comparisons, it seems appropriate to look at the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii or the Maori in Aotearoa or New Zealand. Hawaii gives us dancing and chanting, which is immediately sensed in almost every portrayal of Chamorro pre-contact culture. You can see it. Almost all of the dance practitioners and all the mentors learned their craft from the Hawaiian experience. Even Carlos Taitano, who conceptualized the Tauto Tano as the vehicle for cultural revival, acknowledges that he was inspired through contact with Hawaiians in the 1930s when he was going to school there. Ironically, many of these contacts came through Hawaiianized Taitanos, other relatives, Taitanos who had moved to Hawaii as part of the whaling experience, and they themselves had become Hawaiianized. The Kingdom of Hawaii was not exactly a pre-contact, Western contact institution, but it provided the basis for remembering and taking note of almost every Hawaiian cultural practice that could be committed to memory or print. It's important to remember that the Hawaiian-speaking and writing government entity known as the Kingdom of Hawaii came into existence in the 1800s, a few years after contact with the West, and 150 years after the Chamorro contact with the West. The Hawaiian National Project was derailed by the United States, and they're now part of the 50th state. At this point in time, the Hawaiians have a much more recent memory of their pre-contact past because their pre-contact past is more recent. And they have extensive records of that past, and therefore can reconstruct their ancient past in ways that are simply not available for Chamorros. Well, they have an official apology, U.S. apology for the overthrow, and a possible pathway to developing a nation within a nation via legislation like the Akaka Bill. It seems less than satisfying as hardcore independence activists, but one does acknowledge but the knowledge of pre-contact culture is not only recoverable in Hawaii, it's knowable. That's a very important thing to remember. Essentially, the same historical situation exists with the Maori of New Zealand, Aotearoa. The Maori were established as indigenous peoples of the islands and lived their lives through tribal organization. With the arrival of Western settlers in larger and larger numbers, British control had to be acknowledged, and this was done in the Treaty of Waitangi. In this framework through which special status is accorded to the Maori even as they became a minority group in their own homeland. In many ways, their insistence on an indigenous continuity has accorded them unique standing within New Zealand, including widespread support for culture and language programs and official status as the primary people of the country of New Zealand. Like the Hawaiians, and unlike the Chamorros, the Maoris experienced the weight of outsider contact within the past 150 to 200 years. Moreover, they lived in a pretty large country, New Zealand, in which they could sustain their communities apart from others that were simply not thinkable for Chamorros who were forced to live in villages around churches. Both the Hawaiians and the Maoris have an indigenous pre-contact culture which is knowable. Moreover, between the haka and the hula, they have a cachet which is hard to deny. Who doesn't want to learn how to do the haka? Who doesn't want to learn how to do the hula? And trying to find ways that somehow Chamorros are connected to that. They are forceful, they are direct, and know how to maneuver in societies in which they do not form the majority. International recognition of indigenous groups has helped create safe places for advocacy, meetings, and mutual support. This is embodied in the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, passed in 2007. Interestingly, the 4 nations which voted against the Declaration of Indigenous Rights are Australia, the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. Well, New Zealand later recanted and changed its vote. The other 3 haven't changed their vote. The application of the term indigenous to the conditions of the Chamorro people was first formulated by the Organization of People for Indigenous Rights, OPR. As the chief political strategist for that organization, which had several luminaries that are here this evening, including Laura and Narissa and Hope back there, and Rosa, and is anyone else here that I'm missing? BJ here. These are all people who were involved in this illustrious organization, OPR. So, as the chief political strategist, I plead guilty to using and applying the term indigenous to the Chamorro experience. In fact, I was the first one to do it, and older people come up, indigenous, you know, I used to get that inquiry, and I would try to explain, I would give all the really great explanations. It was clear to me at the time that the Chamorro people had many roads to follow for the recognition of political sovereignty and their residual rights as people of the land, as Tautotano. The OPR imaginatively used the combination of the claim to indigeneity and our status as a non-self-governing territory as the basis to proceed to the next step in political status development. That was not available to any other people, so there was a little bit of creativity in that. So, the non-self-governing territory status gives you the right not to indigenous status. It gives you the right to nationhood. The right to nationhood is different than the right to indigenous status. You accept your struggle for indigenous status if that's all you think you can ever have. But if you give up your right to nationhood, you sacrifice everything. That's the distinction. So the OPR seized upon this by saying we have a status as non-self-governing territory, which people were unaware of. So I went to the UN. I was the first petitioner to go to the UN. And when I went there to the UN, it was in the middle of the Cold War. I gave the presentation. The Cubans and the Iraqis and the Russians, they loved my presentation. The Australians and the Americans, not so much. But they loved my presentation. And the commentary was great. But just to show you the extent of the paranoia at the time, and the widespread confusion of the time, I was telling Chris Paris Howard and Ron Tehan, who came along for the ride. They said, where are you going tomorrow morning? I said, I'll catch up with you at the UN. So I went over to the US delegation, which is right across the street. And I had my presentation. I went over there and I told the security guard, I'm going over there across the street to give a presentation today. Here it is. Then I left. So I could always say, well, I gave them advance notice. Because I don't know. Because the rumors were incredible in those days. That if you went and testified against the US in an international forum like the UN, you could be charged with treason and all these other things. So, you know, what did I know? I wasn't, you know, I think I was all of 33 at the time, you know, trying to figure it out. Now, the quadrant, okay. Now, the question before us is to develop a model which helps us understand whether Chamorro is primarily a reference to an indigenous population of the Marianas or an emerging nationality, a group that parallels Mexicans or Filipinos. Are we engaged in a project for the future or a indigenous rescue effort from the past? When you add that quadrant, the people who look at history will look at the history that puts Guam and the Marianas there between the Philippines and Mexico. Of course, that Mexican-Filipino access that goes back and forth is a product of the Manila Gang and is a product of Spanish colonization. That's what helped create that access. That's what helped create those policies. That's what helped create Villalobos and Olive and Garcia, and help introduce those food products that we now think of as quintessentially Chamorro. But today we have an indigenous imagination as well. We have a Kanaka Maoli fascination. I would call it a fascination with indigenous roots. So the quadrant model that I'm presenting here is not meant to be mathematical, nor is it designed to simplify the historical experience. All of us, especially those of us who think of ourselves as Tafo, who think of ourselves as Chamorros, we're the products of this experience and our imagination. In many ways, this quadrant represents the intersection between what we have lived through and what we think we are. The intersection provides the basis for determining our future. We want to be inspired by our own imagination as a pre-contact indigenous society, which goes back hundreds of years. But we cannot ignore history, even when it seems disagreeable. Moreover, the understanding of Chamorro as a nationality in waiting is not dispiriting, not necessarily dispiriting. The quadrant has possibilities and carries with it not just a legacy of conquest and degradation, but I believe of hope and possibility. Now, the issues which lay before us, culturally and politically, and in terms of Chamorro survivability, are multifaceted and require a broad understanding of the sweep of the Chamorro experience. The reference points for understanding this experience are all in front of us. They're all in front of us in physical form in Hagatna. I hope you go to Hagatna tomorrow and just drive down that street and just bear witness to these physical contradictions that are everywhere, speaking to the quadrant, messing up the quadrant. We're not sure what the continuity or the consistency is all about. The reference points for understanding. At the beautiful new museum which is named the Antonio Palomo Guam Museum and Educational Facility, we are inspired and perhaps a little confused by the symbolism selected to explain our historical past. On the front walls, we are given excerpts from the CHamoru, originally written in English as CHamoru by Dr. Ramon Sablan in the 1930s. On the other side, we're given words from Hurao's speech, an exhortation to people to rise up against the outsiders, which was reportedly delivered in the year 1670. There are two human figures in front of the museum. I don't know, they look like humanoids to me. Both male, interestingly both male, which are depictions of ancient Chamorros, robust and physically well-formed and consistent with the narrative about the physicality of pre-contact Chamorro people and indigenous people. These two look directly across the street, and they're looking right at the Plaza de España. They also look directly at the formerly rotating statue of Pope John II, commemorating the 1981 visit of the Pontiff. Overwhelming the plaza, when you're looking at the plaza from that, is the Guam Insular Force Guard Memorial, which seems awfully out of place to me, but it's there, commemorating the December 10th, 1941 action of the Insular Guard against the Japanese at the plaza. The inherent contradictions of all these physical representations of Chamorro and Guam history are laid out for us to absorb and make coherent, if it is at all possible. Of course, coherence and consistency is not the point of history, but it is the point of narratives embedded in our minds, which must come to coherent conclusions about the sum total of our collective experience. Where does all this lead to? What are we left to believe? And how are we supposed to act as a result of all of these forms in front of us? We have a Guam museum named after Antonio Palomo. Now, the name Antonio Palomo, well, most of us know Antonio Palomo, he's a great man. But the name Antonio Palomo is decidedly Chamorro name, as it would be understood in the Chamorro that was born in the 1830s. That's a real Chamorro name. The name has nothing in common with Kepuha or Matapan. We have Hurao's words of uncertain origin, which were reported in Morales and Ligovia, decades after 1870. We are told that the words are almost 350 years old. We know that the words were first written decades after 1670, and were not translated into Chamorro until 40 years ago. These Chamorro words which are used would have been entirely comprehensible to Antonio Palomo. He'd get it, although awkward and perhaps impenetrable to Hurao himself. I don't know whether Hurao would understand those words, but it's certain that Palomo would have. The words look across the street to the Plaza de España, which was not the original name of that area. As reported in Olive's notes, the Plaza de España was on the east side of the church. On the west side of the church was the Plaza de Magallanes. It's named after Magellan, Plaza de Magallanes. Hurao is really confronting Magallanes, at least symbolically. Maybe not, maybe it's just a kind of a coincidence. Huh? Interestingly, on the back side of the museum, we read words which pledge loyalty to the United States through the words of Antonio Wampat, who stood out as the premier Guam political leader for the first generation after World War II. He stated, "The desire and aspiration of our people to have a legally constituted government and to become citizens of the only country to which we owe unswerving allegiance have long been maintained." I don't know why these words are on the backside, or why American citizenship is not the apex of our development as a people. Perhaps we're ambivalent about it. And this could be entirely understandable. The 500th anniversary of Magellan's circumvention is coming up in 2021. Only 4 years from now. Actually, maybe 3.5 if you go back to March, right? About 3.5 years from now. How we choose to commemorate this event will create that collision course. I doubt that we will restore the name of the plaza given to and call it Plaza de Magallanes. I doubt that anyone want to suggest that? Write to your favorite senator. See if they, well, Senator Will Castro is good. Maybe Senator Castro will pick this up. Given the recent demise of Columbus as a holiday, and I don't know whether you've been reading this, Columbus is now falling on hard times. So now Columbus Day is being declared Indigenous Day. It's just voted in LA City Council last week. It's now officially Indigenous Day, 14-1. I don't know what's going to happen to the Knights of Columbus. What's going to happen to the Knights of Columbus? Are they going to have to change their name? They're going to become Indigenous Knights? Or what exactly is going to happen? And that's the intricacies of trying to extract this. What are we going to do with the Magellan marker in Humata? And the historical addiction that we have to commemorating that visit. Whatever we do, I hope that we'll forever put to rest the idea that Magellan actually showed up in Humata. This still leaves us the question about the birth of the name CHamoru and what it means for us today. Going back to the quadrant, we see the inherent contradictions implicit in the terms Filipino and Mexican, which have been resolved by Filipinos and Mexicans through the process of nation building. These are terms of nationality, terms which are meant to encapsulate the creation of a new nation. The nations of the Philippines and Mexico exist as a result of historical events, not indigenous imagination. Like any nation, they must present the events of the past as leading to no other conclusion than the formation of their respective nations, their nationality, and their essence as a people with a unique historical experience. As with any nation building, they can engage in myth-making. More importantly, they can synthesize and make coherent their story. Perhaps what will happen to the Chamorro people, perhaps we'll only see it at the museum. And maybe that will be the end of the Chamorro people. Now, there's two things that we must do in order to ensure that those things do not happen. The first and foremost is to create and maintain a Chamorro-speaking community. Because the Chamorro language, Lingwahe CHamoru, Fino CHamoru, Fino Hansa, Fino Tautotano, no matter what you call it, is the clearest link between all of those elements. That's the clearest thing. Everything else is imagined and, in a sense, forced. The second thing is that you have to understand the birth of the Chamorro people in the 19th century. This means that we have to stop leapfrogging our history. We have to go right back into the colonial period. And we have to study what happened. We have to find out who these people were. And how did they come to see themselves as Chamorros? How did they identify themselves as Chamorros? These people I'm talking about are some of them might be my grandparents, some are old enough to be them, but certainly my great-grandparents. And for most of you, maybe your great-great-grandparents. When you asked them who they were, they said they were Chamorros. What did they mean by that? They didn't mean that they, they understood that they were connected in some fashion to Hurao and Matapan, but they didn't see that connection. They didn't wear laddie stones around their neck or sinahi. They didn't do those things. Now, I'm not arguing that you shouldn't do those things, but that isn't how they envisioned their world. In fact, they were afraid of laddie stones. So they spent all their time saying, don't go near laddie stones. And then here, what are we doing in the late 20th century? We're making bus stops looking like laddie stones. If you can imagine your great-grandparents coming back and saying, hey, you're tempting fate. Why are you doing that? So you have to kind of understand how those people saw the world. That task is learning what is knowable, not what is not knowable. You can know it. You can know it. And the main vehicle to knowing that is just, a few feet from here, over in MARC. That's the amazing part of it. But if you want to spend more time imagining rather than researching, then we will never really know who these Chamorro people were. I said a lot of things, and I know that some of this is not quite as well formed as I wanted it to be. But the quadrant is important, because the quadrant is that intersection. It's that intersection between history and imagination, between who we are and what we experience. And in order to continue to triangulate and make the world safe for the Chamorro people, we have to engage in that. My favorite statement about the Chamorro nation came from Paul Bordallo, and he gave a presentation here. And he said, I'm a member of the Chamorro nation. I just don't belong to any organization. Now, when he said that, he understood that the Chamorro people were a nation in waiting. He didn't understand it as a pitch for indigeneity. He understood it as an historical project and process that has been abbreviated and truncated. And so the ready models for that, the imagination for that, is the Kanaka Maoli and the Maori, and the ready experience, practical experience of that lies in the Philippines and in Mexico, and both countries whom we share a great deal in common in our experience and our bloodline. So thank you very much. Don't lunas dus masi. I'm happy to answer the questions. Okay, anyone have any questions? Come on. After all that talk, no questions? Gosh. Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. I'm sorry.
You never mentioned the word Tautomona.
No, Tautomona is, the discussion on the Tautomona is unclear whether some people say the Tautomona literally just means people who were here before. So they were first. But some people argue, I don't necessarily buy this, but some people argue that Tautomona was a post-contact, a colonial word that people use to refer to the ancient Chamorro. I don't think, I just think of Tautomona as spirit. Hunggan ba naman na may pio lo ti Tautomona? Hunggan ba? Hunggan. Anyone else? Por favor. Okay, Mr. Servino.
I was curious to hear about the classification of Chamorro versus Mestizo in terms of taxation in that period that you referenced. Do you see that kind of experience or paradigm shift at all taking part today or in recent times?
Well, it's not exactly the same, but you know, the creation of the Chamorro Land Trust. So who gets to, be a participant in the Chamorro Land Trust? That's one issue. So there's advantages to claim an indigenous status, and of course the kind of interesting attempt for people who are arguing for Chamorro self-determination, which is what I totally believe in. So arguing for Chamorro self-determination, having to simultaneously argue in the American court system that this looks like it's based on ethnicity, but it isn't. Of course it is. But we have to argue that, so there's a lot of twists and turns to that. So the compendium of institutional authority and experience is forcing people to go through a lot of mental somersaults. But in the end, that's true of almost any group of people. You have to go through these mental somersaults. The problem for many Chamorros, I believe, is they're not conversant enough with this information to be able to engage this. So the tendency is to just leapfrog by it. So just kind of, they leapfrog going back in time. There we were, a great people, we built Lavi stones, we were all healthy, we were, buff, good looking, physical specimens, living in harmony with nature. Then the Westerner came, and then we were degraded, and then we got short. Maybe we intermarried with Filipinos, I don't know. What made the Chamorro people shorter? All of these kind of silly notions kind of go through that process if you don't take the time to kind of understand what actually happened. So, but what actually happened is that, of course, the islands have a strong indigenous base. But in the process of the 1800s and the 19th century, a nation was being created. And that nation had features of nationalism, not appeals to indigenous identity, but the features of a national group. And what were they using as reference points in those discussions? They were using Filipinos as reference points, because a lot of the Filipinos who were brought here were political prisoners who were telling them this. This is what's going on. And of course they were using people from Latin America and the Mexican experience also to enrich that. So they saw themselves as that. Now, there were still, of course, high-ranking families who saw themselves as the progeny of the colonizer. So, I won't reveal this because I don't want to embarrass anybody, but, I can always tell if I run into, sometimes I'll run into a Chamorro family and I'll ask them, how long have you been here? And the answers are very interesting. So, almost all of them will say, well, I've been here forever. Well, that's the answer. That's the correct answer. I've been here forever. But some will say, oh, my, great-grandfather came here in 1840. And that's how long we've been here. I figured, well, your great-great-grandfather, that's one out of 16 possible ancestors you have. And you've decided to focus on that one, as if that was your point of introduction. And so some surnames use that. Some last names here on Guam use that reference point. And those surnames are not, Naputi or Ugun, but they're more of the other kind, the high-ranking kind. Which, something you might share yourself, Mr. Servino. Yes.
as you might know, I'm quite new to Guam. But what I've noticed is that the term Guamanian is not used as often as I would have expected it to be used, even though it contains the word Guam. So there's your explanation. You're Guamanian, you belong to Guam, you're from Guam, right? And as you said, CHamoru doesn't really explain a whole lot in terms of ethnicity. Why do you think this term is not being used as much anymore?
Well, because I was trying to point out earlier, Guamanian was weaponized, I think, as a term to explain why Chamorros are no longer Chamorros. So that was in almost all the history books that were written in the 50s and 60s started out by saying, just like I quoted Paul Carano, saying that the ancient Chamorros were this, they were, you know, the modern day Guamanian is a pleasing appearance, but the ancient Chamorros, their remote ancestors, were, you know, robust and strong, and, you know, and it leaves you wondering what happened to the modern day Guamanians. So once the Chamorro, the Guamanians, you know, because Guamanian was a kind of an invented term after World War II. So once that term, once the people who used the term kind of started waking up to that in the 60s and 70s, saying, why are we using this term? What does that mean? And so they said, well, you know, the only time you ever use the word Guamanian is when you're speaking English. When you're speaking Chamorro, you don't say, hey, aren't you doing a Guamanian? Unless you're in Saipan, because then they want to put down their fellow Chamorros. Aren't you doing a Turang Guamanian? Turang Guamanian, you got Totsumu, you know, something like that. You know. So unless it was just not used that way. So a lot of people resisted it. Okay? So I wrote this kind of long tongue-in-cheek article about on being Guamanian, which got me into a lot of political trouble, you know, some 20 years later, 30 years later. But it was a tongue-in-cheek article about how did we develop the term Guamanian? So, you believe it or not, and many of you know this, in the late 1940s, they asked the students at George Washington High School, but they were already using it, so it wasn't a real straw poll, but they asked them, what do you want to be called? So they gave them three choices: Guamian, Guamanian, and Guamerican. Okay, man, that's really gone overboard. Guamerican, I want to be a Guamerican. So of those options, Guamanian won. Now, Guamian doesn't work because if you look at it's just in the sound system of English, any word, any place name that has one syllable will always be turned into 3 syllables, or it will remain 1 syllable. So, you know, if you're from France, you're French. You know, so the way that the language works is you have to turn it in. And they didn't want to use Guamese, which also, you know, because it sounded very much like the, you know, hated Japanese and despised Japanese, and that was always kind of looked like, you know, so it was okay for Saipanese to be called that because they were affiliated with the Japanese, or Rotanese, or Tianese, which I never got, but or Guamanian. Now, in the meantime, the political uses of Guamanian have shifted over time, too. So, Governor Bordallo was the first one to use it this way, where he would say, my fellow Guamanians. Then he would explain what he meant. He said, and by Guamanian, I mean Chamorros and Filipinos and, you know, stateside. And that's how he explained it. But, you know, even as he said that, it's very hard to find a Filipino or Korean who said, I'm a Guamanian. Just wasn't, you know, they kind of understood that, you know, Guamanians are Chamorros and we're not. And so it stayed away. Now you have Governor Cabo who's insistent on doing this. See, so, you know, we have Chamorro Guamanians. Well, what the hell is that? That always irritates me. What the hell is a Chamorro Guamanian? You're either Chamorro or you're not. That's how I see it. So now, Guamanian has become the bigger term. So, you know, we have the Guamanian dream. And Filipino Guamanians. So, as you kind of look at that term, you'll have to figure out whether the use of that term will outlive Governor Calvo's term in office, or whether there'll be some really new model coming along. It's just like I often wonder. This is Fanutanan. This semester is Fanutanan. Next year when I'm no longer president, I'm wondering whether Fanutanan will outlive me. So it's one of those things, you know, you throw an idea out and then you see whether it sticks. But so the story on Guamanian is very, very problematic, I think. But you know, when I was a kid, you asked me when I was 12 years old, what are you? I said, I'm a Guamanian. You know? But you know, by the time I turned 21, 22, I said, well, all right, I'm over it. I'm something else now. So that's why you want him, because it's ambivalent. People are not content with the use of it. If you submitted it out as an opinion piece, you know, you did an opinion poll on it, you'd get a lot of disagreement, and the disagreement will be intense. It won't be like, you know, do you like pistachio ice cream or mango? That's not an intense choice. But saying, do you want to be called Guamanian or not? Now that's an intense choice. Because you're going to find people just say, no, I don't know, no way. No, I'm over that. I used to be. We were all Guamanians at one time. So of course there's time lag. So the Chamorros who moved to the States in the 40s and 50s, they kept calling themselves Guamanians long after the Chamorros on Guam dropped it. So I always kind of, you know, find that funny. So you'll find, you can Google the term Guamanian American, and you'll see reference to, you know, articles about Chamorros who live in the States. So it's all over the map.
My question was about, we were looking to the Maori Aotearoa for, you know, some motivation for their revitalization movement. And I wanted to ask more about the treaty. You know, I saw the Treaty of the Waitangi,
Yeah.
and is it because that the Chamorros were colonized since the 1600s, and these treaties were more around the 1800s that we see with the Maori and also Native American tribes? Is that why it wasn't an option? And I just wanted to see, is that's one of the ways that, you know, indigenous groups have kind of validated power for more hands-on management of resources, of social programs and all of that. So just to speak to that treaty option.
And that's a very important political question, because it's at once a strategic question about, it's a question about how you see yourself, and it's also a question, strategic question about how you want to argue for rights and privileges and management of resources. So those two questions are combined in that. So what I'm arguing is that, of course, yeah, the Treaty of Waitangi and the experience of the American Indians in the 1700s and 1800s meant that they experienced their decimation and their really disruptive experience with colonizers within the past 200 years. So it's possible to remember that. It's possible. That pre-contact experience in many ways is knowable. For the Chamorros, because it happened so long ago, it's not knowable. So when we start talking about it, a lot of the times we're just, we're engaged in conjecture, and we use comparisons to other ethnographic studies of people who are similar to us. And that's what we use as the basis for knowing what our pre-contact roots are. Now, the second question is, do you want to be treated as an indigenous group? Because indigenous groups in today's world get certain rights and privileges. Like, for example, fishing. So, is there such a thing as a Chamorro right to fish? That because you're an indigenous person over and above non-Chamorros here in Guam. Is there such a right? Okay, so where that question comes up, as it comes up in the Pacific Northwest, usually, or sometimes around the Great Lakes, where Indian tribes have those rights, it's usually a product of a treaty. They wrote a treaty. They wrote a treaty that said, you know, we have rights forever. So, you know, the first people in Canada and the Native Americans there in Washington State, you know, they can catch all the salmon they want. They can do anything. They can go out and hunt and fish any day of the week. Nobody's going to bother them because they have that right implicit as indigenous. So, did Chamorros ever sign a similar treaty? No, we didn't sign a similar treaty. So how are we going to get those rights? So we just argue for them. Since they have it and they're indigenous, we should have it because we're indigenous. But somewhere along the line, the argument kind of breaks down. See? So that's my point. So I understand that fully. So when you read the argument about the fishermen down in the Ganya boat basin, you know, I have a right, this is the way that, and I love when people say that. My people have been fishing this way for hundreds of years. Really? Really? Tell me how they've been fishing for hundreds of years. You know, did they put on their tanks and get their spear guns and go down there? Is that how they did for hundreds of years? How did they do that for hundreds of years? So that's the allure of the imagery is stronger than the reality. So, my argument, if you ask me, my argument is it would be better to create a Chamorro-based nation. That way you can make all the decisions for yourself. And you can stop trying to argue for indigenous status within a broader nation. So, for the Maoris, the Treaty of Waitangi gives them that. For the Hawaiians, the overthrow of their monarchy, you know, gives them certain kind of residual cachet. You know, people who live in Hawaii gotta know that they're there because, you know, they illegally overthrew a legitimate government. So, that's true. What do you get out of that? Well, you can argue for things. You can argue for special land rights. You can argue for this. What can you argue for people that have no clear path to knowing who they are? So, when I'm asking a 15-year-old, a Chamorro 15-year-old, who's doing one of these dances, which were created out of the Guahu Tautotano format. So the Guahu Tautotano celebration, I guess, pageant. The Guahu Tautotano pageant was the creation of Carlos Taika. And then he engaged me to be the scriptwriter. And I was the scriptwriter because he said, unlike most other Chamorro speakers, I could tell the Spanish words from the Chamorro words, which, you know, which was true. And hey, can't do that. So I was in that fashion. We would model chants. Said, let's do a chant. Let's make up a chant. So we'd make up a chant. Then I'd write the words, and then we would do the chants. Then we'd, you know, get a bunch of young people in there, and they would do the chants. Well, if you fast forward that, you know, 20 years later, someone who's 15, who's doing these chants, who are being told these are chants from ancient Chamorros, well, what's a 15-year-old to believe? He believes it. You can't tell a 15-year-old, these are like chants we created, and they sound like what chants would have been like if we had known what they really were. But that's okay, but they didn't do that. So what happens is that, you know, when I would get this thing, You know Dr. Underwood, or you know Congressman Underwood? We're going to do an ancient chant for you. All right? Now, I can't wait to hear this. Sounds very familiar. I can't wait to hear this chant. But I have to confess that it was very thrilling, was very satisfying, was very engaging. So even a hardened historian like myself, who should know better, is taken in by it. All right, I'm feeling better, you know. Hita! Hita ni matoto todo! I feel better already. But, you know, I don't know whether they actually said that. I don't know, but I feel better. So it's the resource issue. Like I said before, the reason why the Maoris and the Kanaka Maori are attractive is because they live in large Western societies in which they are a minority group. So how do they continue to survive? They've adopted certain strategies based on what they can know about themselves. And that's a very powerful message. And it's an engaging message. So, you know, if we can get, you know, the Haka and the Maori men and the Maori women sticking their tongue out at you and doing the hula and all that, all very, very powerful and engaging. So, you know, it makes other Pacific Islanders feel like, wow, why can't we do that? You know, why don't we do something like that? So we'll get dances. We'll get that. Sometimes we'll see some of these dances, you know, and you've seen these dance groups. You know, so some dances, the guy will stop and he'll give us a lecture. You know, he'll give us an angry lecture. Hita! Protect Kalomo! Adayo! And I'm thinking, you know, if you want to give a speech, just give a speech. Dancing is supposed to be about something else. Dancing is that you're conveying a message through movement. Not if you just want to give a speech, just give a speech. You know, but you know, and the whole notion. But on the other hand, artwork is creative and inspirational. So, you know, the creative dance is possible, and pageant making. And when you look at the Ballet Folklorico in Mexico, or you look at the Bayanihan dance group, Philippine dance group, both the Bayanihan and the Ballet Folklorico do traditional pre-contact dances. But they're just performances, you know, they're just kind of performances. And so that's okay. And then they get to the real dancing, you know, where they're playing guitars and mandolin and dancing around. But they never say, neither the Ballet Folklorico nor the Bayanihan ever says, these are our Spanish dances. Because once you say that, you've already conceded you're not who you say you are. So when the dance groups, when the Chamorro dance groups stand up and say, these are our Spanish dances, I think to myself, that's a mistake. That's a major mistake. Those are not Spanish dances. That's the way your grandparents and your great-grandparents and your great-great-grandparents danced and entertained themselves. Those are not Spanish dances. Those are the dances of your ancestors. That's, you see? So in the you know, the Filipinos they're not apologizing for playing the guitar or the mandolin. They don't. They just play it and they, you know, and the Mexicans do the same thing. And the Mexicans, you know, they play the accordion and they dance the polka, which they learned from Germans and Czechs and things like that. And nobody ever says, wow, don't do that because that's not a Mexican dance. Nobody says that. They just absorb it and they make it who they are. And that's what Chamorros ought to learn how to do. They can't, once you start adopting these kind of hard and fast divisions on that, what you're really doing is you're accepting what the colonizer had told you from the very beginning. Is that you were great once, but you're no longer great today. Okay?
since you had government influence from an outside party, from your island, did it influence the island in a positive direction?
Yeah. Well,
Because here's why I'm asking this, because I'm trying to think if Mexico has the same type of potential. Being a third world country and, being subjected to a lot of poverty, a lot of corruption, and all these different things. Is there hope to be able to bring a country out of obscurity? And for what I've seen so far here, even though it's just a small fragment of a country, it's looking favorable in a good way, that it did influence it in a positive way. Does that make sense?
well, it makes sense depending upon what you're, what you're valuing, and in essence, what you think is important. So my position here is that what is most important to me is concern over the survivability of the Chamorro people. So in trying to understand the survivability of the Chamorro people, I have to look at their integrity and find out who they are. And I'm just telling a kind of a cautionary tale that riding the indigenous Kanaka Maori kind of axis is insufficient to do that. Now, Mexico, of course, is a huge country and has a lot of countervailing influences in it. But the advantage that both Mexico and the Philippines have is they have the authority to write their own national script. So that's what they have. So they can, Mexico can, tell the mestizaje story and make it stick. And the Philippines, they can do the Filipino, the nationalist story and make it stick. That doesn't mean that they don't have inherent contradictions, and they do. But they also are nations that can help make coherent their own narrative. And so they have that. And just the way the United States has a way of making coherent its own narrative. I went to one interparliamentarian union with members of the Mexican Congress, and this was, I'd say in the mid-90s. And I was trying to make a point which, apparently both the American congressmen and the Mexican congressmen were just really pissed off because I had made this point. I said, contradictions in national lives are part of the framework of a national life. But it's how you deal with contradictions that define your values. So the United States is basically an immigrant country, but it has so many problems with immigrants. So the contradiction of how to deal with immigrants in the middle of saying that they're an immigrant country is just like an amazing phenomenon. It tears the country apart. They have all this. I said, in Mexico, well, the Americans said, well, that's not true. We're all immigrants. They kind of simplified it. I said, and here in Mexico, we were in Huatulco at the time, which is, I think Chiapas is the next state over from Huatulco. And in Chiapas, they were having a breakdown in civil authority in Chiapas. I said, here in Mexico, all the indigenous symbols are celebrated, but indigenous people are not part of the mainstream. They're not getting educated, they're not, and that's a contradiction. Well, the Mexicans, they got all mad. I think they tried to take my gifts away from me. Gave me some really nice gifts, I never saw them again. but it's that's what we're faced with. So when you're developing the narrative for the Marianas Islands, if the Spanish-American War had never occurred, right? At the end of the day, there still would have been a Philippine Republic, because that Philippine Republic was already in the making. So that Philippine Republic would have occurred in 1900, 1910, 1920. At some point in time, they would have created the Philippine Republic. And that would have left the Marianas Islands. So what would have happened to the Marianas Islands? They weren't going to be a province of the Philippines. And they would have been cut off, and they would have eventually become a Republic of the Marianas. And the basis of that, the historical basis of who the people are of the Republic of the Marianas Islands would have been the Chamorros I was talking about in the 1830s. They would have, that would have been the historical imagery. They would have done the dances, the ancient dances, but they would have focused more on who they were as they were emerging in the 1800s. So that would be the, now, in terms of like, you know, you're talking about the economics and the social services or things like that, well, of course, we're part of the American framework, and so there's a lot of advantages that are there. But as always, you have to ask yourself whether gaining those advantages is worth losing your soul or coming to an end, coming to your own demise. So the Chamorro people are facing their own demise. It's an open question whether they're still going to be Chamorros by the end of this century. That's an open question. So how do you create that? How do you forestall that? So, you know, you can create, you can manifest and refine the indigenous version or view of it, because the indigenous view of it gives you the reference point from which to survive in a society in which you are not the majority, in which you do not control all the institutions. And that's the whole point of the UN Declaration on Indigenous Rights. When you read through that whole declaration, it's all about, you know, giving a certain resources, certain part of the land, recognizing these people. It's not about creating indigenous nations. That's not part of it. The modern nation state is a different reality and only overlaps with indigenous concerns imperfectly. In some places it might work, but in most places it does not.
So in other words, they have a different agenda. They have a different agenda than the United Nations that you're talking about?
Well, the United Nations is, you know, it's an agenda that's born on, you know, guilt. I would say the Declaration on Indigenous Peoples is based on guilt, and also as a way to stick it to countries that have large populations with indigenous people. So, you know, Mexico voted for it. Huh? So they voted for the Declaration on Indigenous Rights, but how does that change the status of indigenous peoples in Mexico? The United States voted against it, you know, and how does that affect the status of indigenous peoples who live under the U.S. flag? I'm not sure that it did anything, either way. So in large measure, it's symbolic, but it, like I said, it gives you a safe space. Gives you a safe space to discuss those things, but it doesn't extend real power to you.
Thank you.
Que viva Mexico. All right, so, you know, that's it. All right, I'm out of gas, and like they used to say, when I was young, and old people, the older people used to say, Esto la lesu. I already ran out of English. And nowadays we say, Esto la CHamoru.
Thank you, Doctor. Okay, don't go anywhere. I want to fill up your gas there. All right, Dr. Underwood, we have a gift for you. We have what we call the honorarium sponsors. We have 11 sponsors that gave us coupons so that you and your wife can eat at our local eateries. You have a gas coupon at Circle K for $50. Unfortunately, I couldn't get 2. Everything else is for 2. And these eateries include Amista, of course, Circle K. We have Cold Stone Creamery, Crest Pizzeria. I'm not going to pronounce that other one. It's too hard for me.
How about Mezcla?
Mezcla. Mezcla. King's Restaurants, Linda's Cafe, Lone Star Steakhouse, Wendy's, Fruits, and Yogurt Man. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I want to remind you next month our keynote speaker will be Eva Kuske, the one who asked the first question.
All right.
She's going to talk to us about the, what is it? post-colonial English-speaking community here on Guam called CHamoru. All right, see you next month.